Welcome to the first lesson on the third topic, which is why did peace collapse in the 1930s? We'll be looking here today the long-term consequences, and more acutely on something we've covered earlier this year by looking at the peace treaties of 1919 to 1923, and in particular how they dealt with Germany and the impact that had on creating long-lasting resentment, of course, which manifests itself in the Nazi Party, which leads Germany in a path towards World War II. So in the 1930s, we have to see that it's a time of increasing tensions. As we saw in our last unit, the hopes of the League of Nations and of international cooperation sparked by things like the Kellogg-Briand Pact, where the nations who signed it agreed to renounce war as a method of their foreign policy, and the Locarno Treaty, which effectively got Germany to agree to the borders set by the Treaty of Versailles, which got Germany to agree, amongst other things, that at least on its western borders, the Alsace-Lorraine would always be part of France, etc., etc. This created a lot of hope that the new Germany would be a peaceful Germany willing to work with its European neighbors and not invade them again. The Locarno Treaties, of course, came hand in hand with the Allies allowing Germany into the League of Nations and, of course, helping them out of their current financial mess following the hyperinflation in 1923-24. On the other hand, Germany, Italy, and Japan, by the end of this decade, would turn their back on those international deals and at least all expand their power at the expense of smaller, less powerful nations, most of whom were their neighbors. So we see a very dramatic shift in the period of about 10 years from the beginning to the end of the 1930s. And this really unit concerns itself with why that shift was in fact so dramatic. Let's take a look at each of the dissatisfied powers now with the peace treaties. And first, of course, it's Germany. And we know that Germany objects to almost every aspect of the Treaty of Versailles. They hate the territorial provisions. They hate the Saarland being occupied by the League of Nations. They hate that the Rhineland had to be demilitarized, the loss of Silesia, the creation of this Polish corridor, splitting East Prussia off from the mainland body of Germany through a bit of Poland. And of course, there's also the loss of Alsace-Lorraine to a lesser degree. They despised the disarmament clauses. They felt it wasn't necessary, or it didn't give them enough provision to remain safe. They hated the fact that they had to accept war guilt, which of course was a condition for Germany to make it legal to charge Germany reparations for their actions and to send a bill of approximately £6.6 billion in 1918 currency to, rather 1919 currency to Germany as a cost of the damage that the country needed on Belgium and France primarily in the First World War. Germans, on the other hand, of course, as we know, saw this entirely differently. They believed that they had been stabbed in the back. In fact, they had not lost the war, and the acceptance of the war guilt and the fact that they surrendered and had to sign and say that they were the ones who gave up was something that a lot of Germans didn't accept. They believed that, in fact, they had been undermined by communists and Jews at the end of World War I within Germany, and that they could have continued to fight on and perhaps even be successful had these people not stabbed in the back and basically got rid of the old power structure of the Kaiser and replaced it with a socialist-leaning one. The German politicians who signed the Treaty of Versailles become known as the November criminals who stab the German nation, and more particularly the German army, in the back, as evidenced by this incredibly anti-Semitic cartoon from a right-wing German newspaper printed in 1924. The man holding the knife is the second chancellor of the Weimar Republic. The Weimar Republic is the name of the German government that takes over from the Kaiser in 1919 and forms a democratic government for Germany. It's known as the Weimar Republic, just as an aside, because the government itself was formed in Weimar, which is a city in southeastern Germany, and therefore it's named after the place it was founded. Italy, on the other hand, had also not been very happy with the peace treaties. You'll recall the fact that Italy was actually on the sides of the winners, and they had in 1915 joined the Allied forces in exchange for what they thought at the end of the war would be humongous territorial provisions to be given to them, mostly from Austria, and therefore they broke with their 1914 pre-war alliance with Germany to join Britain and France. And they hoped that they would, of course, be repaid. Amongst the things they wanted were the Adriatic port of Fiume, and areas along the Austrian-Italian border in an area that they call Istria. In the end, they actually received very little. The Italians aren't really listened to in the peace conference, and in fact, the Italian PM would actually leave the peace conference and protest altogether. They referred then to the war as a mutilated victory, and the peace treaties as a mutilated peace. So, as such, that Italy was hurt or disgraced by the lack of possessions it gained. Like a soldier who had lost a leg, it felt that it had lost all of these people for nothing. Therefore, it had been mutilated for nothing at all. And it allowed, actually, in a very short period of time, Italy to fall to extremists. By 1922, the dictator Benito Mussolini is in charge of Italy, promising many things to recoup Italy's stolen pride, restore an Italian empire. And as you know from the last unit, of course, they attack Abyssinia in 1935. They mess around in Corfu in 1923. The individual on the right is probably one of my favorite historical characters. It's an Italian nationalist poet, cinema producer, and intellectual named Gabriele D'Annunzio. He is really, in many ways, the founder of that sort of idea of fascism, strong, powerful, dynamic, aggressive leadership. And he actually forms a band of 2,000 angry ex-soldiers, and he seizes the Adriatic port of Fiume himself in 1920, and in 1920 he actually holds his Adriatic port for about half a year. He runs it as a little dictatorship, which is an embarrassment to the Italian nation. Eventually the Italians have to invade Fiume and get D'Annunzio out of there, but he becomes a national hero. He becomes a model for people like Mussolini, and he is, in his time in power and in his time in Italy, one of the most eccentric characters, strangest individuals in history. In fact, I have many stories about D'Annunzio. My favorite one, anyway, is that Mussolini considered him a threat to his power because he was equally as popular. And D'Annunzio actually falls out of political prominence by having dinner with Mussolini and during dinner accidentally falling out the window. At least that's how the story goes. Back to Germany now. The Treaty of Versailles had other negative effects apart from angering the people. Number one, it probably wasn't strong enough, and the French would argue this. It didn't disable Germany entirely. It didn't prevent her at all from growing into a powerful European state. Germany will recover in a relatively short period of time, say approximately 15 years, economically from the First World War, which is pretty striking considering the treaty sought to cripple Germany. And even though it loses territory in all its colonies, it still has considerable resources at its disposal. So by no way is Germany completely crippled. Okay? Add that, the fact that it's not crippled, to resentment and a potential reasons for revenge. This makes Germany very dangerous. And of course, in this context grows Hitler and the Nazis. And of course, we'll talk about this in greater detail later on, but a couple things to think about. His ideology, which we'll look at in class, which was written in his book Mein Kampf, published in 1924, was heavily influenced by the Treaty of Versailles and the need to destroy it. Almost every demand and every action he takes between 1933, when he becomes Chancellor of Germany, and 1939, when World War II begins, involves some sort of violation of the Treaty of Versailles. And like many Germans, because many Germans obviously vote for him, he believed the treaty was unjust. Okay? He hated the Treaty of Versailles. He publicly condemned the politicians who signed it. He called them, of course, the November criminals. He was one of the chief propagators or user of that term. He said the Treaty of Versailles was a constant reminder to the Germans that they had lost the war and that they were being humiliated. And therefore, he vowed and promised to overturn this treaty. And even though, when he comes to power, some of the aspects of the Treaty of Versailles, such as reparations, have been overturned by things such as the Dawes and the Young Plan. Hitler does promise to take it further, and the resentment was so great of the Treaty of Versailles that the concessions already made before Hitler even comes to power by the Allies are not enough to satisfy Hitler and his followers. Additionally, the idea of the loss of territory becomes a central component of Hitler's promises to the German people. He wanted the lost territory in Eastern Europe back. He wanted to unite with Austria. The Anschluss, which had been of course, forbidden in the Treaty of Versailles, and it's also coincidentally forbidden in the Treaty of Saint-Germain with Austria. He wanted to get German minorities out of other countries. Parts of Germany had been locked off and given to new countries, such as Poland, in Silesia, in Czechoslovakia, and the Sudetenland. And he wanted to carve out a German empire in the East, to re-establish the great Eastern German Empire, and even go further, to give the Germans, who are quite a lot of them, in a relatively small space, Lebensraum, which is in a German word meaning living space. And to do this, of course, he promises to rearm Germany in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. Also central and a cause of Hitler's ideology was a hatred of communism. Now, he always did hate communism, but his hatred of communism was, I suppose, reaching fever pitch by the time the First World War ended, because he saw communism as linked with the stab in the back, the November criminals. It is true that the first government of Germany after the end of World War I it's a democratic government, but it's led by socialists. And in that government, there are a large degree of communists. The first leader himself was a leader of a socialist party. To Hitler, socialism, which can work within democracy as long as it is largely representative and gives back to the people at the expense of the rich, he saw communism and socialism as indistinguishable. And he begins to associate the fact that a lot of the leaders of the new Weimar Republic happened to be communists, a lot of them also happened to be Jews, and he makes this connection that communism and Judaism, or as he calls it, Jewish Bolshevism, are one and the same. And again, as I mentioned a second ago, he thinks they're central to the stab in the back of the German army that, of course, he was a part of in 1918. He also thought that they wanted to take over Germany and that Germany was at risk of falling into the hands of the communists, just like Russia had in 1917. He believed, also in his ideology, that by expanding east, getting Lebensraum, he would be able to defeat both the Jews, who were at this time majority living in the east, and the communists in one final swoop. Additionally, the Treaty of Versailles had a long-term impact on British and French opinion, which was quite different. In fact, it divided British and French opinion. The harshness and the suffering of Germany actually I suppose, forced a lot of British people, or made a lot of British people, moderate their opinions on the Treaty of Versailles. They were pretty satisfied, actually, initially with the treaty, but by the early 1930s, the tune of the people and the people in the British government had changed, and they started to believe it was too harsh. They saw the disaster of the Great Depression for Germany as potentially as a result of the treaty and therefore unfair. Additionally, they saw the hyperinflation as being caused by the treaty and the disaster of that as being, perhaps too much of a punishment for the German people. Also, British politicians saw it as their duty to assist Germany in achieving a peaceful revision of the treaty. The British, after all, of course, were somewhat responsible for the nature of the settlement, and therefore British politicians, particularly the Labour governments of the 1930s, saw it as their goal to help Germany revise the terms of the treaty. The French, unsurprisingly, still saw the treaty as not harsh enough. Okay? They saw Germany as getting rich and wealthy again, and they had wanted, of course, Germany to be permanently disabled. And by the 1930s, it was clear that Hitler had aimed to overturn the settlement, the Treaty of Versailles, and they did not feel confident enough to confront Hitler alone. So the fear of Nazi Germany, would force the French to moderate themselves and work with the British to ensure that both nations were unified against Germany. So in other words, where the French would have taken a hard line and perhaps invaded to prevent Germany from working within the Treaty of Versailles, in this case, they had to take a much harder line, or a much more moderate line, because they needed British support. The French realized they couldn't do it alone, and the British weren't willing to give their support unless the French moderated their tone against Germany. And as such, both Britain and France, as a consequence of the treaty, are less able to deal with, or are more willing to work with, a German government that's looking to overturn the Treaty of Versailles. What we have is then, with the Treaty of Versailles, a settlement of inconsistencies. Okay? The peace treaties themselves, rather than giving long-lasting peace, had created a whole series of inconsistencies and anomalies. A good example East Prussia is separated from the main bulk of Germany by the Polish corridor. And you have a group of Germans, a large number, several million Germans living in East Prussia, but without the ability to travel continuously through their country into the other aspect of their country. They would actually have to get out of their country, go into Poland, and then re-enter Germany. Okay? The city of Danzig on the Polish corridor was overwhelmingly populated with Germans, although it was under the control of the League of Nations, and this seemed really unfair and inconsistent. Additionally, as alluded to before, 3.5 million Germans were now under Czech rule in the Sudetenland and didn't want to or really express any interest in being part of Czechoslovakia. And this all lent credence to sort of Germany's demands for revision of the Treaty of Versailles, and also demands or ideas that the treaty perhaps wasn't fair or was inconsistent. Okay? Now, at the time in 1919, these could all be justified in one way or the other. However, for the Germans, they all represent a series of grievances that would have to be dealt with in one way or the other. And Hitler, at one point, becomes the man who says, I can settle those grievances. Of course, Britain is sympathetic to many of these and will want to resolve them in a peaceful, orderly manner. Hitler would use that against them, and he has very clear and other ideas about how he wants to settle this. And of course, this is something we'll look at as we go through this lesson. So that is really the first lesson. A lot of review, but you need to put it in the context of what's happening in the 1930s and see how the influence of the Treaty of Versailles had a long-term impact on why peace would begin to collapse by 1939. Or actually would collapse altogether by 1939, but would begin to collapse by the early 1930s.